The smell hit me before I even pushed open the booth door. Carnations. Sweet and wrong in the way that flowers always are when they're sitting next to something dead. Father Novak had called it in at 6 in the morning, and by the time I got to St. Michael's the candles were already lit for early Mass and about a dozen parishioners were standing in the back of the nave looking confused and frightened and very cold. Chicago in February will do that to a church. The stone pulls the heat right out of the air. I remember thinking that whoever built these places must have wanted people to feel mortal. Officer Dennis Patrice was sitting in the confessor's side of the booth. Not the penitent's side. The priest's side. Whoever put him there knew the difference. He had his hands folded in his lap like he was the one hearing confession, and between his palms was a single white carnation, stem trimmed clean, petals still carrying moisture. Fresh. Cut that morning or the night before. His eyes were open. His face was calm. The hole in the back of his head was small and neat, and the wood behind him was dark with what had soaked in overnight. Patrice had been dead since at least 10 o'clock. The booth had muffled whatever sound there was, and St. Michael's sat between a rail yard and a printing house, and nobody on North Cleveland heard a thing. Hi. I'm Detective Jack Mahoney. 40 years Chicago PD. I'm recording these because someone should know the truth about what happened in the city, and most of the men who knew aren't talking anymore. Some because they're dead. Some because they're smart. I'm neither. I'm just old and I can't sleep, and the stories are still there when I close my eyes. This is the one I think about when February comes around. When I smell carnations at a wake and have to step outside. I call it the Gardner case, though that name came later. It started with a phone call at 5:50 in the morning and a dead cop 3 days from retirement, sitting in a confessional like he was waiting for absolution he was never going to get. Dennis Patrice had 27 years on the force. He was 51 years old. He'd been planning to move to his sister's place in Racine. He'd told everybody about it, the fishing, the quiet, the way the snow looked out there without the soot in it. He was the kind of man who had already bought the fishing rod. Had it boxed up in his locker. I know because I went to the locker that morning before his wife was called, and I stood there looking at that rod and I didn't know what to do with my hands. His captain was Pete Selker, who had been my captain too for 6 years in the 40s until I asked for the transfer. Selker was the kind of man who ran a precinct the way a shopkeeper runs a store. What comes in, what goes out, don't look at the back room. He called me before the body was even cold, which I thought was strange. Patrice was his man. If anything, I'd have expected him to call somebody from his own house. Instead he called me, and he said, "Jack, I need someone I trust on this," and I heard something in his voice that I couldn't place yet. I would place it later. I always do. St. Michael's was German Catholic, old neighborhood, working men's parish. The kind of church where the stations of the cross are carved from actual stone and the pews have been polished by 60 years of wool coats. Father Novak was 70-something, small, and shaking from more than cold. He'd found Patrice when he came to unlock the church at 5:30 for the 6 o'clock Mass. He said he'd seen the booth door slightly open, and the booth was always kept closed, so he looked. He kept saying the same thing in Polish between his English sentences. I had a man from the neighborhood translate later. It meant something like, "Not in this place. Not here." The medical examiner put time of death between 10 and midnight. Single gunshot wound to the back of the skull, small caliber, close range. Professional or practiced. No sign of struggle. No defensive wounds. Patrice had walked in there, or been walked in there, and whoever had done it had sat down across from him in the penitent's booth or stood behind him, and had done it quietly and quickly, and had then taken the time to fold the dead man's hands and press a fresh carnation between them before walking out of a church in the middle of the night on the north side of Chicago. I want you to sit with that detail. The flower. Someone brought it. Someone cut it fresh, or bought it that evening, and carried it to a murder. That's not rage. That's not opportunity. That's ceremony. I started where I always start. I started with who hated him. 27 years leaves marks. I spent the first 2 days pulling at threads. Patrice had worked narcotics for 4 years in the early 40s. That's the kind of assignment that makes enemies who don't forget. He'd made 60-some arrests that stuck, testified in court on 14 cases. 3 of those men were still in Stateville. 2 had died inside. The rest were out. I talked to his wife, Marguerite, who was a small, quiet woman who had clearly been holding something back since the moment the uniform knocked on her door. She told me Dennis had been receiving telephone calls in the evenings. The past month or so. He would take the phone into the kitchen and close the door, and when he came back he'd be quiet in that particular way that meant he didn't want to be asked. She said she'd thought it was a woman. She said it without bitterness. 27 years of a cop's marriage, and she'd learned to think the worst and prepare for it. There was no woman. I found the connection on day 3, and it came from a man named Caulfield, Ray Caulfield, who ran a bookie operation out of a dry goods store on Milwaukee Avenue. I knew Caulfield the way you know furniture. He'd been in the neighborhood since before I had my shield. He called me through a mutual party because he had information and he wanted something for it, and that's when the bribe happened. He didn't hand me an envelope. It wasn't like that. He sat across from me in the back of his store with pickled smell of the place all around us, and he told me what he knew, and then he slid a key across the table. He said there was a locker at Union Station with $1,200 in it, and the key was mine if Caulfield's name appeared nowhere in the paperwork. $1,200 was more than 6 months of my salary. I left the key on the table. I've thought about that a lot in the years since. Not because I'm proud. Because I'm not sure I left it for the right reasons. I told myself it was integrity. I think part of it was fear. Fear of what I'd become if I said yes. Fear of what Selka would hold over me. I was already thinking about Selka by then. Already wondering about that phone call at 5:50 in the morning. Already thinking about the back room. Caulfield told me anyway. He told me because he was more afraid of someone else than he was of me, and he needed a detective looking in a particular direction, which should have made me suspicious of what he said. But the information was solid, and it pointed me right at a man named Victor Stasik. Stasik had been a courier for a numbers operation Patrice had dismantled in 1944. He'd done 4 years in Joliet, and he'd come out in 48 with a grudge that several people had heard him talk about in bars. He was a thin, nervous man, mid-30s, lived alone in a third-floor apartment on Damon. He grew flowers in his window boxes, geraniums in summer. In February he had carnations there in little clay pots. I saw them from the street before I went up. I arrested Stasik on a Tuesday morning. He had no alibi for the night Patrice died. He had a .32 revolver registered in his name. He'd been seen near St. Michael's twice in the month prior by a neighbor who remembered because she thought it was strange. Stasik was Lutheran. He sat in the interview room and sweat through his shirt and told me he hadn't done it, didn't do it. They all say that. I'd heard it enough times that I had stopped listening to the actual words. I was watching his hands. The DA liked Stasik for it. Selka liked Stasik for it. I liked Stasik for it. We had enough to charge, barely, and the machinery started moving. I went back to the church because I couldn't stop thinking about the flower. Father Novak let me into the sacristy and we sat for a while, and I asked him, not about the body this time, but about Patrice, whether he'd known him. Novak was quiet for a long time. Then he told me that Dennis Patrice had been coming to confession at St. Michael's for the past 6 weeks. Not his own parish. Patrice was St. Stanislas, couple miles east. He'd come to Novak specifically. A priest he didn't know, in a parish that wasn't his. Novak couldn't tell me what was confessed. I understood that. But he told me one thing, and he was careful about how he said it. He told me that Patrice had been a man carrying the weight of something he'd done a long time ago, and that in their last conversation, Patrice had indicated he was going to try to make it right before he left the city. 3 days from retirement. Going to make something right. I went back to Caulfield, and this time I didn't sit down. I stood over him in that pickled air room, and I told him what I knew and what I suspected, and I told him the key was still on the table where I'd left it, and he could go back and get it, or he could tell me who else wanted Dennis Patrice in the ground. Caulfield told me about a man named Leonard Goss. Goss was not a criminal in any way the city would recognize. He was a businessman. He'd owned a trucking company since the late 30s. Respectable. Member of the Chamber of Commerce. He'd served on a civic committee with Pete Selker. He'd lost a brother, younger brother, Eddie Goss, in 1942. Not in the war. In a narcotics arrest that went wrong. The official record said Eddie Goss had pulled a weapon and been shot in the subsequent struggle. The officer who fired was Dennis Patrice. What the record didn't say was that Eddie Goss hadn't been armed. That Patrice had planted the gun after. That 2 other officers who'd been there had signed off on the version that kept Patrice out of a courtroom and put Leonard Goss into 7 years of quiet, patient, cold-burning fury. Patrice had figured out that Goss knew. That was what the telephone calls were. Goss, calling to tell him he knew, telling him the evidence was coming, telling him there was no Racine, no fishing rod, no quiet snow. And Patrice, I think Patrice had gone to Father Novak because he was trying to find a way to confess to something he couldn't confess to publicly. He was going to try to make it right. I believe that. It doesn't fix anything. Goss had a greenhouse behind his house in Evanston. He grew carnations year-round. His late wife had loved them. His housekeeper told me that, nervously, on a Thursday afternoon while Goss was at his office downtown. I had the housekeeper show me the greenhouse, and I stood in it for a while breathing warm damp air that smelled like February shouldn't smell. I found the gun in the soil under a workbench. He'd cleaned it but not well enough, and he hadn't gotten rid of it yet, which told me he was either confident or stupid, and Goss was not stupid. He was confident. He'd sat on 7 years of calm fury, and he'd planned this carefully enough to carry a fresh flower to a murder, and he'd thought he was finished. He wasn't finished. I went to Selker before I went to the DA. I laid it out for him. Starsick in a cell who hadn't done anything. Goss with his hands clean enough to pass for innocent if you didn't look at the dirt. And the real story underneath all of it, Eddie Goss, and the planted gun, and a dead cop who'd been trying, at the end, to do something decent about a rotten thing he'd done in the middle. Selker looked at me for a long time. He said, "Jack, be careful." I said, "I'm always careful, Pete." He said, "No, you're not." He wasn't wrong. But he didn't make a call. He didn't pull the file. He sat there and he let me walk out of his office, and I think about that too. Goss was charged on a Friday. Starsick was released without comment. The DA handled the publicity carefully. Communist paranoia was in the air that year. Every story needed a shape that made sense to a nervous public, and a grieving brother who'd waited too long didn't fit any of the shapes they were selling. It got 3 inches in the Tribune. Goss got 17 years. He died in 1958, still in Stateville. Victor Starsick took his geraniums and his carnations and his window boxes and moved somewhere. I don't know where. I never found out if he knew how close it had come for him. Patrice was buried with full honors. 3-volley salute. Marguerite in a black coat, very still. The fishing rod was still in his locker. I signed off on the paperwork to have it released to the family. I don't know what they did with it. Here's what cost me. Not the bribe. I'd been offered money before. I'd be offered it again. The key on the table wasn't the last one. What cost me was the moment in Selker's office when I understood what he was telling me without saying it. Be careful. Not careful for my sake. Careful for his. because Pete Selker had known about Eddie Goss for a long time. He was one of the men who'd signed the paperwork back in '42. And he'd called me at 5:50 in the morning because he needed someone he trusted to look where Caulfield pointed and stop looking after that. He needed the case closed on Stasek. And I'd almost let him have it. I didn't do anything about Selker. That's the truth of it. I had the shape of it, but I didn't have the proof, and I was tired, and the case was solved in the way the city calls solved, and sometimes that's all there is. Sometimes the rotten thing underneath is too deep and too wide, and you're one man with unsteady hands and 40 years of knowing what the city is, and you drive home through February sleet and you take your coat off in the dark hallway and your wife says, "Jack," and just from the sound of your name in her voice you know she knows it went sideways somehow, and you sit down at the kitchen table and you drink the coffee she puts in front of you and you don't say anything for a while. The carnations are gone from Goss's greenhouse now. I drove past the house once, years later. Different family. The greenhouse is a garage. I still can't walk past a flower shop in February without slowing down.